Why did the Admiral dismiss her with such finality? Why did he look her in the eye, then strip her of every ounce of value with just 3 words, only a medic, as if her entire existence aboard the USS Constellation was reduced to bandages and bedpans? Sarah Mitchell walked the narrow steel corridors of the carrier with that phrase burning in her mind. The Mediterranean sun burned just as hard outside, glaring off the deck, but the real heat was inside her chest. She wasn't supposed to care this much. She'd been taught that the Navy was a machine of order, rank, and hierarchy. Feelings had no place in it, but she cared anyway. She cared because she knew something no one else did, something that could change everything. At 5'4", with auburn hair tightly pulled back in regulation style, Sarah rarely stood out. She had built her reputation in sick bay, not on the bridge, not in the war rooms, not in the places where decisions were made. A hospital corpsman second class, that was her world. Gauze, IV lines, steady hands that could thread sutures through torn flesh. She had earned the respect of her fellow medics and even her commanding physician. But respect in one hallway didn't carry across steel decks. Not when the man at the top of the chain of command had just told her that security was none of her business. The words stung more than she wanted to admit. She replayed the moment in her head, the way Admiral James hadn't even looked up from his charts when she spoke. She stood at attention, voice steady, daring to volunteer for the upcoming security briefing. But his answer had cut her down like a careless knife. Leave security matters to the professionals, Petty Officer Mitchell. You're only a medic. She had saluted, turned, and left as ordered, but the echo of it clung to her. Only a medic. The corridors of the Constellation hummed with life. 3,000 sailors moved with the rhythm of a floating city, preparing for port in Djibouti. The ship was a marvel of steel and power, nuclear-driven, bristling with jets, brimming with trained personnel. And yet, Sarah felt invisible here, surrounded but unseen, trusted with blood but not with truth. She leaned against a bulkhead outside sick bay, trying to steady her breathing. She told herself she didn't care what thought. She told herself it was pride, nothing more. But deep down, it wasn't pride, it was fear. Because what she had noticed, the quiet pattern hidden in medical logs, the strange cases of sailors stumbling in with nausea and headaches, wasn't just coincidence. Her instincts told her it was reconnaissance, testing. Someone probing the ship's defenses, not with bullets but with biology. And if she was right, then they weren't safe at all. But no one wanted to hear that from her. She returned to sick bay where Commander Hayes, the ship's doctor, glanced up with her usual sharp but kind expression. Hayes had always treated Sarah with fairness. Not indulgence, not dismissal, just fairness. "Mitchell," she said, lowering her glasses, "you've been off your game lately. Everything all right?" Sarah hesitated. Words pressed against her throat, but she held them. Should she tell Hayes what she suspected? Should she risk another dismissal? Hayes was reasonable, but even she might say the same thing. Food poisoning is just food poisoning. Don't chase ghosts. Sarah forced a nod. "Yes, ma'am, just tired." But she wasn't tired. She was restless. Restless because she couldn't stop seeing patterns. Restless because her gut screamed at her every time she thought about those sailors, about the timing, about the intelligence reports filtering through the ship's rumor mill, whispers of AL movements, threats against U.S. presence in the region. The Horn of Africa wasn't quiet, and yet everyone acted as though Djibouti was safe, routine, predictable. That night she stood alone on deck during her break, staring out at the Mediterranean horizon. The sea was calm, dotted with distant fishing vessels, lights twinkling like stars on water. To anyone else it was peaceful. To Sarah it was heavy. She thought about her father, his voice, steady and certain, from years ago on the Montana ranch where he had trained her with a rifle. "Distance is just a number, Sarah. Respect it, calculate it, but never fear it." He had been a Marine sniper, 3 tours in Afghanistan, a man who carried silence the way others carried shields. He had taught her that marksmanship was never about the weapon. It was about the stillness of the mind, the discipline to act in the space between heartbeats. She had won state championships before she ever thought of medicine. Precision shooting had been her first language. Healing came later. But when she enlisted, the Navy hadn't asked about rifles. They had only wanted her hands, the hands that could sew, the hands that could revive. And she had locked away the rest as if her past with crosshairs didn't exist. Now, as the wind brushed her face, she wondered if she'd been wrong to bury it. Because somewhere out there, beyond radar range, beyond the horizon, someone was planning something. And when it came, her medical skills might not be enough. The next morning, the USS Constellation pushed toward Djibouti. Sarah was awake at 400, completing her checklists: supplies, medical coordination with local hospitals, crew records updated, every task completed with precision, but her unease didn't lift. By 600, the ship began maneuvering into port. Usually, arrivals were celebrations, vendors gathering on the docks, locals flooding the waterfront to glimpse the carrier. But not this time. The harbor was quiet, too quiet. Sarah watched from her position, binoculars in hand. At first it looked normal: workers moving crates, adjusting lines, securing equipment. But then she saw it. Movements too synchronized. Men who carried themselves not like laborers but like soldiers. One in particular drew her attention. He wore the same coveralls as the others, but his stance was different. His eyes weren't on cargo, they were on the ship. And his position gave him a perfect view of the bridge where stood. Her blood chilled. They weren't dockworkers, they were waiting, watching, preparing. Sarah's pulse hammered as she lifted her radio. "Bridge, this is medical. I'm observing suspicious activity on the pier. Request permission to report to security." The answer came cold, clipped. "Medical, this is Bridge. Maintain your assigned duties. Security concerns are not within your scope of responsibility." Dismissed again. She swallowed hard, switching frequencies. "Security, this is Petty Officer Mitchell in medical. Observing coordinated movement on the pier, tactical in nature." Chief's voice snapped back. "Unless someone's bleeding, Mitchell, stay off security channels. We've got professionals handling this." Her jaw clenched. She lowered the radio. Through the binoculars, the man on the pier shifted again. And this time she saw it. A long cylindrical case sliding behind containers, angled perfectly toward the ship. Her stomach dropped. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't coincidence. It was a weapon. For a long moment she just stood there, frozen. Every protocol screamed at her to stay in her lane, to let others handle it. But instinct, deep, unshakable instinct, told her if she stayed silent, people would die. So she moved. She ran the corridors, her heart hammering louder than the klaxon of docking machinery. She ignored the stares, the salutes, the questions. She went straight to the Admiral's quarters. The Marine guard stiffened. "Ma'am, the Admiral isn't seeing anyone." "Lives are at stake," she cut in. Her voice cracked with urgency she couldn't contain. The door opened before the guard could stop her. Admiral stepped out, his face dark with disapproval. "Petty Officer Mitchell," he barked, "what is the meaning of this breach of protocol?" Her throat felt dry, but her words poured out anyway. "Sir, we're in immediate danger. Hostile forces are on the pier. I observed coordinated positions. They're preparing to engage during docking procedures. One has a weapons case trained on the bridge." His eyes hardened. "Enough. You are confined to quarters pending disciplinary action. Security will escort you immediately." Her chest tightened as the Marine moved forward. She wanted to scream, to shake him, to make him understand, but it was too late. They dragged her away, locked her in. Through her porthole she watched the pier. The men were still there, the case was still aimed. And the ship was still blind. She pressed her forehead against the glass, her pulse trembling in her veins. For the first time, she wasn't just afraid for herself. She was afraid for every soul on this ship, because whatever was coming, they weren't ready for it. And nobody would believe her until it was too late. Why was the port so quiet? That question lodged itself in Sarah's mind as the USS Constellation finally came to rest against Djibouti's pier. The massive vessel groaned as mooring lines were hauled taut, the sound of steel and rope filling the otherwise empty harbor. Empty. That was the problem. She had docked in ports before, and it was never like this. A carrier's arrival was usually an event, a spectacle that drew crowds, dignitaries, and vendors hopping for American dollars. Today there were no cheers, no bustling market, no curious children waving from the shore. Just silence and the hollow shuffle of workers who seemed far too focused on their positions. Sarah sat on the narrow bunk of her quarters, a Marine guard outside her door, confined, stripped of movement, her fists clenched and unclenched as she stared through the porthole, eyes fixed on the suspicious figures below. She'd already warned them. She begged them to listen, but her words had vanished into the same void as her rank. Only a medic. She pressed her forehead against the glass, watching as one of the dockworkers shifted again. He wasn't hauling cargo, wasn't gesturing to others, wasn't behaving like any worker she'd ever seen. He was aligning, calculating, his body angled just so, eyes never leaving the ship's upper decks. She could almost feel his intent. Her stomach tightened with dread. Every instinct screamed, but instincts didn't matter in the Navy. Protocol did. The intercom crackled overhead, its cheerful tone painfully at odds with the weight in Sarah's chest. Now arriving, Admiral to the ceremonial quarterdeck. All senior officers report for official greetings. Her throat went dry. That was it. That was the moment they'd been waiting for, in his dress whites. Department heads lined up at his side. The ship's entire leadership exposed like targets in a gallery. Sarah gripped the edge of her bunk, trembling with helplessness. She could already see how it would play out, the sniper, elevated, steady, calm, finger tightening on the trigger. Her warnings had been brushed aside, her voice silenced, and now men and women would die for it. A sharp knock startled her. The Marine swung the door open, revealing Commander Hayes still in scrubs, hair pulled hastily back. Her expression was tight with worry. "Mitchell, what the hell happened? I hear you've been confined for insubordination." Sarah's chest heaved with the weight of everything she'd been holding in. "Ma'am, I tried to warn them. I saw the positions. I saw the case. They're going to strike during the ceremony." Hayes's eyes narrowed, skeptical but not dismissive. "Sarah, do you hear yourself? You're a medic, not intelligence. You're seeing ghosts." "No, ma'am." Sarah grabbed her superior's sleeve, desperate. "I grew up learning how to spot this. My father was a Marine sniper. I know what coordinated movement looks like. This isn't paranoia. This is preparation." For a heartbeat, Hayes studied her face. Sarah's voice wasn't wild, wasn't panicked. It was sharp, steady, grounded in certainty. Hayes stepped to the porthole, lifting binoculars Sarah had left on the sill. Her silence lasted longer than Sarah expected. Then Hayes exhaled, low and unsteady. "That man, he hasn't moved his eyes off the bridge in 10 minutes." Sarah nodded fiercely. "And the case? Look at the angle, it's a sniper's nest. They've been waiting for it to step into the open." Hayes lowered the binoculars, the color draining from her face. "God help us." The ship's PA system chimed again. Admiral now approaching ceremonial quarterdeck. Both women froze. Hayes turned sharply. "If you're wrong, Mitchell, you'll be court-martialed, but if you're right." Sarah finished for her, her voice barely above a whisper. "If I'm right, people are going to die while we argue about protocol." Outside the porthole, shadows shifted. The dockworkers, the attackers were adjusting, finalizing. The man with the case crouched low, movements calm, deliberate. Hayes swore under her breath and grabbed Sarah's arm. "Come with me." They hurried through steel corridors, their boots striking the deck in urgent rhythm. Sarah's heart pounded as every second stretched into an eternity. She could almost hear the click of a safety being released somewhere out there, the inhale of a sniper steadying for the shot. They burst into the bridge, drawing startled looks. Officers bent over charts and displays glanced up in irritation. Lieutenant Commander Jackson, the officer of the deck, straightened. "Commander Hayes, the Admiral is." Where? Hayes cut him off. "On quarterdeck, ceremonies begun, unless this is a medical." "It is an emergency," Hayes snapped. "We've got potential hostile activity on the pier. I've seen it with my own eyes." Murmurs rippled across the bridge, skeptical, disbelieving. Sarah stood at Hayes's side, feeling the weight of every dismissive glance. She was the medic who cried wolf, the corpsman who saw conspiracies. And then, as if to punctuate her warning, the ship's Combat Information Center reported in overcoms. "Bridge, CIC. We're detecting active radar originating from the pier. Source appears to be targeting equipment." The bridge went still. Active targeting radar. That wasn't speculation. That was confirmation. Admiral stormed back onto the bridge, expression stormy. "What's this nonsense?" Hayes turned, her voice sharp. "Sir, Mitchell identified hostile positioning hours ago. I confirmed her observations myself, and now CIC's reporting targeting radar." But's jaw was tight, his pride still bristling. "Are we really basing threat assessments on the instincts of a corpsman? I will not." The sound cut him off. A single, cracking shot echoed across the harbor. Everyone froze. On the quarterdeck below, the command master chief stumbled. Blood blossomed across his pristine uniform, spreading like fire through snow. He collapsed, sailors screaming as chaos erupted. "Sniper on the pier," voices shouted. The bridge exploded into motion. His face went pale as the realization hit. Mitchell had been right all along. "General quarters, sound general quarters," he barked, the weight of command dropping over him like armor. Alarms wailed, sailors sprinted, but it was too late for surprise. The enemy had already seized it. Sarah's breath caught as she looked through the glass. More muzzle flashes sparked from the pier. Not just one shooter, multiple. Dockworkers shedding their disguises, rifles raised. A coordinated assault, precise, lethal. Her pulse raced, but her heart sank at the same time. She had tried to stop this. She had tried to tell them. And now, everything she feared was unfolding in front of her. Slammed his fist onto the console. "Return fire, neutralize those shooters." But the ship's heavy weapons were useless here. Giant cannons designed to strike other warships, not snipers among shipping containers. Security teams scrambled, but they were exposed on deck, scrambling for cover as shots rained down from elevated positions. Sarah gripped the railing, torn in two. Every instinct screamed at her to run to sick bay, to do what she was trained to do, stop bleeding, save lives. But another part of her, the part she had buried, the part her father had raised, knew that medicine alone wouldn't stop this. Not today. Her chest tightened, a war inside her heart. She was a healer, but she was also something else, something the Navy didn't even know it had. And if she didn't act soon, no one would be left to heal. How many lives could have been saved if they'd just listened? That thought haunted Sarah as alarms screamed through the corridors, echoing off steel walls like war drums. The USS Constellation was no longer a floating city at peace. It was a battlefield. Boots thundered on deck above her quarters. Voices barked over the intercom. Gunfire cracked across the water, followed by the sharp, terrifying whistle of ricochets slamming into the ship's superstructure. Sarah sat rigid on the edge of her bunk, her chest tight, breath shallow. She could see it unfolding through the narrow porthole, the ambush she had tried so desperately to prevent. The pier erupted with muzzle flashes, men moving like phantoms between containers, rifles spitting fire into the open ranks of exposed sailors. She pressed her palm against the glass, powerless to do anything but watch. Her guard had left his post the instant the alarm sounded, leaving her alone. But confinement still clung to her like shackles. She could roam the corridor if she wanted. But what then? Where could she go? She wasn't armed. She wasn't authorized. She wasn't trusted. Only a medic. The words echoed like a curse, like a weight pressing down on her chest. Yet even now in the chaos, a part of her wanted to believe them. She was a medic. That was her role. That was her duty. She could help in sick bay. She could patch wounds, stabilize the dying, ease the suffering. That was what she was trained for. But what good were bandages against bullets still flying? What good was she if the leadership kept falling, one by one? Through the porthole, her heart lurched as she saw Admiral step onto the bridge wing again, shouting orders over the chaos. His white uniform made him a beacon, a target. Sarah's blood ran cold. She knew how a sniper's eye worked. The precision, the patience, the inevitable moment when the crosshairs settled on a chest and the finger began to tighten. She turned away, fists trembling. She couldn't watch, not again. The door banged open, startling her. Commander Hayes burst in, her face pale, breath ragged. "Mitchell, get moving. Sick bay's overflowing. I need every set of hands." Sarah stood instantly, her body torn between relief and dread. Relief, because she finally had a role again. Dread, because she knew the wounded were only piling up because her warnings had been ignored. The corridors blurred as they sprinted together toward medical. The ship shook faintly under the percussion of nearby gunfire. The smell of oil and steel and gunpowder filled the air. Sarah's pulse pounded so hard it made her vision flicker. Sick bay was chaos. Beds overflowed with sailors, uniforms soaked in blood. Medics shouted over each other, rushing between casualties. The command master chief lay on the surgical table, pale but alive, surgeons working frantically to keep him that way. Marines groaned on stretchers, their bodies torn by grazing rounds and ricochets. Sarah slipped into motion instinctively. Gloves snapped on. Gauze pressed into wounds. Voices barked for supplies, and she was already there, handing off clamps, sliding IV lines into place, working with the precision that had made her invaluable. This she understood, this she could do. But even as she moved, her ears stayed tuned to the ship's comm system. She caught fragments of the battle above. Multiple shooters, elevated positions, can't get a clean shot. The words were jagged shards in her mind. Every stitch she tied, every artery she clamped, was shadowed by the knowledge that more sailors would soon be carried in, because the attack wasn't over, because the enemy still had the advantage, because her voice had been silenced when it mattered most. She pressed gauze into a Marine's shoulder wound, blood seeping hot through her gloves. "Stay with me," she whispered, though her own voice trembled. "You're not going anywhere, not today." His eyes fluttered open, glazed with pain. "Doc," his voice cracked. "Are we losing?" Sarah froze. She wanted to say no. She wanted to tell him everything was under control. But she couldn't lie, not even to ease his suffering. Her jaw clenched. "We're still fighting," she said finally. "That's what matters. You just focus on breathing." But inside, she wondered if the fight was slipping away. Another stretcher barreled through the doors. A young sailor, blood soaking his leg, screaming as medics rushed him onto a bed. Shrapnel wounds. Another casualty from ricochets tearing into the superstructure. Sarah moved fast, numbing, cutting, pulling fragments of jagged steel from his flesh while he cried out. She kept her face calm, but inside, every scream felt like an indictment. This shouldn't have happened. The intercom crackled again, Admiral's voice hard and tight with fury. "General quarters, hold positions. All security teams engage. Neutralize those shooters." Sarah's hand stilled for just a fraction of a second. The Admiral still didn't see it. He still believed they were in control. But she knew better. She'd seen the coordination, the precision. These weren't desperate militants firing wildly. These were trained professionals executing a plan, and they wouldn't stop until they'd gutted the ship's leadership. Her chest burned with frustration. If only they'd listened sooner. If only she'd had the courage to push harder. Maybe she could have prevented this. Maybe she could have stopped the blood now pouring through her gloves. A voice cut through her spiral. "Mitchell, pressure here." She snapped back, moving fast, pressing hard into another wound. Her hands knew what to do, even when her heart didn't. Minutes blurred into hours, every second filled with screams, shouts, the clatter of instruments. Sarah's muscles burned, sweat dripping into her eyes. She saved lives. She lost others. And each time a stretcher arrived, she wondered, would the next one carry Admiral? Would the sniper finally take him? She hated herself for thinking it. Hated herself for imagining the Admiral falling when she had once sworn to save any life, no matter the uniform, no matter the rank. But she couldn't stop it. Not after the way he had dismissed her. Not after the way he had silenced her warnings. And yet deep inside she knew. If the moment came, if he fell before her hands, she would fight just as hard for him as for anyone else. Because that was who she was. A medic, a healer. But also something more. Because no matter how many wounds she stitched, the gunfire above never ceased. The wounded kept coming. And Sarah realized with a sinking clarity that medicine alone couldn't stop this tide. At some point, she would have to choose. Remain in the role they had given her, or step into the role no one expected. The role that could save them all. How many more could she patch before the next stretcher came through the door? That question gnawed at Sarah as the med bay filled with the cries of the wounded. Every cot overflowed, every table was occupied, and the air reeked of blood, antiseptic, and fear. The command master chief still lay unconscious, surgeons bent over him. Marines bled from grazing shots, sailors from ricochets. Every corner of the room screamed urgency. And yet beyond the sealed doors, the battle raged on unchecked. The pier was alive with muzzle flashes. The Constellation's great guns were silent, useless in such close quarters. The enemy had chosen their ground well, hiding in stacks of shipping containers in elevated positions, among civilian infrastructure where the Navy's firepower couldn't touch them. Sarah pressed gauze against a sailor's abdomen, holding his gaze steady while his blood soaked through her gloves. "Stay with me," she whispered. "You've got this." But her own voice sounded hollow, because she knew the truth. No matter how many veins she clamped, no matter how many wounds she stitched, the flow of bodies wouldn't stop. Not until someone silenced the rifles still spitting fire from the pier. She was treating the aftermath of a battle. No one else seemed able to win. "Mitchell," Commander Hayes's voice cut through the noise. She stood at the far table, her surgical mask spattered with red. "More incoming. Clear a space." Sarah's chest ached. How much more could they take? The intercom blared with fragments of tactical chatter. "Sniper position still active. Can't get a clear line of fire." Her stomach turned cold. She knew what that meant. The enemy sniper hadn't been flushed out, which meant and every officer near him was still a target. The Admiral's voice soon followed, harsh, strained. "Hold positions. Suppressive fire. Keep the enemy pinned down." Sarah bit her lip until she tasted blood. Pinned down. They weren't pinning anyone. They were being shredded by precision fire from positions they hadn't even identified. And then the sound that made her heart stop. Another sharp crack across the water. Not random gunfire. Not automatic spray. A deliberate single shot. Sarah froze, scalpel in hand, her chest tight. She didn't need to see it to know. A sniper's bullet had just found its mark. She turned her head, almost against her will, toward the ceiling above her. Was still standing. Was another officer falling even now? The stretcher that burst through the doors moments later answered her. A sailor, pale and limp, blood pumping from a wound in his chest. Not a graze, not shrapnel. A precision hit. The med bay roared into motion, but Sarah stood paralyzed for a breath too long, staring at the wound. It was too clean, too deliberate. This wasn't chaos. This was an execution, methodical, one by one. Her hands shook as she finally moved, clamping, suturing, fighting. But her mind was no longer in sick bay. It was on the pier. It was with the man she had seen crouched behind that case, adjusting his scope, waiting for his perfect moment. And her father's voice whispered through the years, "A sniper doesn't miss, he waits." Sarah pressed harder on the wound, her jaw clenched. The man she'd seen wasn't just firing randomly. He was hunting, and stubborn, visible, defiant was his prize. She realized something then. If the Admiral fell, the entire ship's command structure would crumble. Chaos would consume them. More would die. And all she'd be able to do was watch the wounded pour in until her hands couldn't keep up anymore. She couldn't stand it. "Mitchell," Hayes barked, snapping her back. "Focus." Sarah blinked, nodding, returning to the sailor on the table. But her movements felt automatic now, her hands moving on instinct while her thoughts raced elsewhere. Protocol had trapped her in this room, but protocol wasn't saving anyone. Somewhere above still stood exposed. Somewhere above, a sniper's crosshairs still lingered over his chest. And Sarah knew down to her bones that unless someone acted, the next stretcher would carry him. Her pulse thundered. Her gloves were slick with blood. Her father's voice whispered louder. "Any weapon can be precise if the mind is steady. Don't fear the shot, respect it." A flare gun. She remembered the one she had seen in the navigation bridge's emergency locker. Crude, not designed for combat, but it fired a projectile, and projectiles under the right hands could mean the difference between life and death. The thought terrified her. She was a medic. She wasn't supposed to think this way anymore, but she couldn't shake it. The next announcement nearly made her knees buckle. Admiral on the bridge wing, directing fire. Sarah closed her eyes, her breath trembling. She could see it in her mind. The Admiral's white uniform lit by sun, his chest steady, his voice barking orders. And somewhere across the harbor, a finger tightening on a trigger. She opened her eyes, heart hammering. No, she couldn't let it happen. For the first time since the alarms began, Sarah tore off her gloves, blood dripping from her hands. Hayes looked up, startled. "Mitchell, what are you?" "I have to go," Sarah said, her voice hoarse but firm. Hayes frowned. "You're confined here." "Protocol is killing us," Sarah snapped, louder than she meant. The room fell silent for a heartbeat. Even the wounded stared at her. Hayes's jaw clenched. She studied Sarah's face for a long, agonizing second, and then, softly, "Where are you going?" Sarah swallowed hard, to stop the bleeding at its source. Hayes hesitated, then gave the smallest nod. "Go." It was the permission Sarah hadn't dared hope for. She tore through the corridors, heart pounding, lungs burning. Alarms shrieked around her. Sailors rushed past with weapons. Gunfire cracked from the pier, echoing through the steel like thunder. She ignored it all, her eyes fixed on the ahead. The navigation bridge loomed above. She burst through the hatch, startling Petty Officer Martinez, who was crouched by the rail with binoculars. "Mitchell," he said, wide-eyed, "what the hell are you doing up here?" Sarah didn't answer. Her gaze darted to the emergency locker. She yanked it open, her fingers closing around cold steel. A flare gun, heavy, awkward, but real. She turned it over in her hands, her mind already calculating. Range, wind, trajectory. Martinez's voice trembled. "That's not a weapon, you can't." "It's enough," she whispered. Through the binoculars she could see him, the sniper crouched, steady, focused. His rifle aimed, scope trained. And his target was exactly where she knew it would be. Admiral framed in sunlight, oblivious to the crosshairs closing on his chest. Sarah raised the flare gun. Every muscle remembered. Every lesson her father had drilled into her surged back. Breath steady, shoulders relaxed. Sight picture, trajectory, wind, respect the shot. Her heartbeat slowed. The world fell silent. Between one breath and the next, she pulled the trigger. The flare bucked from the gun, a streak of fire arcing across the harbor. For a heartbeat she thought she'd missed, thought she'd failed. But then impact. A burst of red phosphorus exploded behind the sniper, showering him with fire and smoke. He jerked, his shot ripping wide, missing by feet. The harbor lit up with red smoke. marking his position like a beacon. Sarah's chest heaved as Martinez stared at her in disbelief. "You just marked him," she finished, her voice trembling. "Now they know where to shoot." Below, sailors shouted as rifles turned toward the crimson plume. Gunfire erupted, concentrated, relentless. The sniper's carefully hidden nest was no longer hidden. Sarah slumped against the railing, the flare gun slipping from her grip. Her hands shook, her breath ragged. She had done it. She had saved him. She had crossed a line she could never uncross. And for the first time, she wasn't just only a medic. She was something else entirely. How do you explain saving a man who never believed in you? Sarah leaned against the bridge railing, her chest heaving, hands trembling. The flare gun still smoked faintly where it lay at her feet, its barrel scorched. Across the harbor, red smoke curled upward from the sniper's ruined position, a signal as bright as any flare of distress. But it wasn't distress, it was revelation. "Security teams," voices shouted below. "Target marked, engage." Rifles cracked in unison, a concentrated storm of fire hammering the sniper's nest. The man who had been so patient, so precise, so deadly was now forced to move, scrambling under a hail of bullets. His carefully chosen cover was lit up, exposed, burned away by Sarah's shot. Martinez lowered his binoculars, mouth open. You just saved the Admiral." Sarah didn't answer. Her chest rose and fell in violent rhythm. Her ears rang with the phantom echo of her father's voice. Marksmanship isn't about the weapon, it's about the moment, the discipline to act when no one else can. She had acted, and in that moment she had stepped out of her cage. But what came next? The bridge door slammed open. Officers rushed in, faces flushed with adrenaline, eyes darting between the battle and the woman standing with a flare gun in her hand. Admiral entered last, his uniform disheveled, his expression carved from stone. His gaze swept across the scene, Martinez wide-eyed, the red smoke outside, and Sarah, her chest still rising and falling like waves against a cliff. For a long, unbearable second, silence clung to the bridge. Then spoke Mitchell. Her stomach knotted. She forced herself to attention, though her arms still shook. "Sir." His eyes held hers, no longer cold dismissal, no longer careless superiority, but something else, something heavier. "Report to my station, now." The order carried no fury, no scorn, just authority tempered with something new, something Sarah couldn't name. She followed him into the main bridge, every eye tracking her as though she had grown taller, heavier, changed. In truth, she had. Stopped at the tactical display, pointing at the live feed of the harbor. Hostile positions still burned red on the screen. The battle wasn't over. If anything, it was shifting. The attackers, though disoriented by the loss of their sniper, were regrouping, their movements disciplined, their retreat calculated. Mitchell said without looking at her, "Your assessment." Sarah blinked, startled. "Sir." "You marked their sniper. You saw what we missed. You're going to tell me what you see now." Every officer on the bridge turned at once. She felt the weight of their skepticism pressing against her skin. She was a corpsman, a medic. She had no place here, and yet his eyes demanded it. Sarah stepped forward, swallowing her fear. She studied the display, tracing the attackers' retreat with her finger. They're pulling back in good order. That means this isn't desperation, it's planned. Fighting withdrawal, textbook. They're moving toward the western dock area. The security officer frowned. "We've already got teams there. They'll intercept." Sarah shook her head. "No, look here." She pointed to a narrow water channel, a vein of dark blue cutting through the map. "That's the choke point. Only viable escape route for fast boats. That's where they're heading." His brow furrowed. "How long?" 10, maybe 15 minutes at their current pace. She hesitated, then added, "Sir, if they reach that channel, they'll vanish into Somali waters before we can pursue." The room went silent again. Every officer understood what that meant. They'd survive this ambush only to face it again, stronger, deadlier, planned with even more precision. Turned slowly, his gaze sharp as a blade. Options. The security officer shifted uncomfortably. Sir, ship's weapons can't engage without collateral damage. Too close to civilian structures. Helicopters risk international incident. Shore pursuit is possible but— Too slow, Sarah interrupted. The words escaped before she could stop them. Every head snapped toward her. Heat burned her cheeks, but she pressed on, her father's training uncoiling inside her like a second spine. Sir, we need precision fire on that channel, not ship's cannons, not bombardment, precision. His eyes narrowed. From who? The question hung heavy, and then, impossibly, she answered it. From me. The silence that followed was suffocating. A corpsman, a medic, standing on the bridge of a U.S. aircraft carrier, asking to take up a sniper's rifle. The security officer scoffed. She's not trained for. But lifted a hand, silencing him. His eyes drilled into Sarah, searching, weighing. Explain. Her throat tightened, but her voice was steady. Sir, I've been shooting precision rifles since I was 12. My father was a Marine sniper. He trained me. I competed, state champion long range. You saw what I did with a flare gun. With the right weapon, I can stop them before they reach extraction. The room shifted, murmurs, skepticism. A few stunned faces, but said nothing. He only studied her. Finally, he turned to the security officer. Do we have a rifle? Yes, sir. M110 in the armory. Get it now. The officer hesitated, his tone sharpened. That's an order. Sarah's chest tightened. The words were impossible, unreal. Minutes ago, she'd been confined to quarters, silenced as nothing more than a medic. Now the Admiral himself had ordered her armed. Martinez stepped forward, his voice low but steady. Sir, I'll spot for her. Sarah turned, surprised. He nodded once, his face grim. She's not wrong. She saw it before any of us did. Within minutes, the rifle was in her hands. The M110, heavy, cold, familiar. She checked the chamber, adjusted the scope, her fingers moving with the muscle memory of years gone by. It felt terrifyingly natural. Martinez crouched beside her as they set up on the port side of the ship's superstructure, the narrow channel in full view. Through the scope, Sarah saw the first glint of movement. A rigid-hull inflatable boat cutting through the water, sleek and fast, another trailing behind. Her pulse steadied. The chaos of sick bay faded. The noise of the battle dimmed. There was only the scope, the crosshairs, the line between life and death. Martinez whispered, range 1,000 meters, bearing 270, wind 10 knots southeast. Sarah adjusted, her breathing slowed. Her father's voice returned, soft as memory. Find the pause between heartbeats, that's where the truth is. She exhaled, her finger tightened, the rifle bucked. Through the scope, she saw the round punch into the engine compartment of the lead boat. Metal exploded in sparks. The motor seized, the vessel jerking to a halt in a spray of seawater. Martinez whispered, stunned, Target 1 disabled. Sarah worked the bolt, chambered another round, swung to the second boat. Its driver was weaving, frantic, trying to dodge the inevitable. Range 750. Still closing, Martinez said, voice tense. Sarah tracked the zigzag, predicted the angle, breathed, waited, fired. The round struck low, tearing into the hull beneath the waterline. The boat lurched, water flooding in, its speed faltering. Both extraction boats neutralized. Sarah lowered the rifle, her body trembling but her eyes steady. Enemy stranded, she reported, her voice calm, controlled. They're not getting out. The bridge erupted in shouts, radios crackling as security teams confirmed the sight. The attackers on the pier faltered, realizing their escape had been cut off. Some tried to flee, others to fight, but the tide had turned. Admiral's voice filled the comms, steady, unyielding. Outstanding work, Mitchell. Security teams close in. End this. Sarah sat back, the rifle heavy in her lap, her chest rising with the weight of what she'd done. She was a medic, she was a sniper, she was both, and for the first time neither role felt like a contradiction. She had saved them. But as the harbor burned with the remnants of the ambush, she wondered what it would cost her. What happens when the chain of command admits it was wrong? Sarah cradled the rifle across her lap, her pulse still unsteady. The echo of her last shot lingered in her bones, as if the weapon itself had stitched something permanent into her. She had disabled their escape. She had stopped them. The extraction boats floated crippled in the channel, one dead in the water, the other sinking slowly as seawater poured through its torn hull. Across the harbor, the enemy fighters wavered. The precise, disciplined withdrawal dissolved into frantic motion, men shouting, waving, gesturing without coordination, without their leader, without their boats. They were stranded, cornered, outmatched. The bridge erupted in chatter. Officers relaying orders, security teams advancing, the sound of gunfire shifting from sharp precision to scattered desperation. Martinez still knelt beside her, his binoculars pressed to his face. "They're breaking, corpsman. You nailed them." Sarah didn't answer. She stared at her hands, trembling faintly where they gripped the rifle. She wasn't supposed to hold this weapon. Not here. Not like this. She wasn't supposed to be the one who decided who lived and who didn't. Her job was to stitch life back together, not to tear it apart. And yet she had, twice now, once with a flare, once with this rifle. The comms buzzed to life, his voice cutting sharp across the chaos. All stations remaining hostiles appear to be surrendering. Hold fire, secure the perimeter, prepare to take prisoners. Surrender. The word washed over Sarah like cold water. The battle was ending, not with more bodies carried into sick bay, but with raised hands and dropped rifles. Martinez lowered his binoculars. His face turned to her, eyes steady, voice soft. "You saved us. You know that, right?" Sarah swallowed, her throat tight. She wasn't sure if saved was the word. She had acted. She had done what no one else could or would, but at what cost to herself? She set the rifle gently on the deck beside her, as though it might burn her fingers if she held it longer. The door to the bridge slammed open. Admiral strode in, his expression thunderous but not with anger, with purpose. His gaze swept the room, then fixed on her. "Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying weight. "Report." Sarah stood, snapping to attention out of reflex. "Sir, both extraction boats disabled. Hostiles stranded and surrendering. No further immediate threat." Her words were crisp, controlled, but inside her chest felt heavy. Studied her for a long, tense moment. The man who had dismissed her as only a medic just hours ago now looked at her like she was something else entirely, something he hadn't accounted for. Finally he nodded once. "Outstanding work." The bridge fell quiet. Officers glanced at one another, surprise etched across their faces. Didn't hand out praise easily, but he hadn't hesitated now. He turned back to the tactical display, issuing orders. "Security teams, proceed with detainment operations. Medical, prepare to receive prisoners for treatment if necessary. All stations stand by for post-action reports." Sarah felt the tension in her legs release, as though she might collapse. She lowered herself into a chair, her pulse still racing. The med bay needed her. Wounded still waited. Prisoners would soon arrive. And yet she couldn't bring herself to move just yet. Because in this moment, for the first time, the Admiral had seen her. Not as a medic, not as a burden, but as someone who had saved his ship. The harbor grew quiet over the next hour, the gunfire replaced by shouts and the clatter of boots. Hostiles were marched in under guard, their hands bound, faces grim. Some bled from minor wounds. Others glared with cold defiance. But all were alive. Sarah returned to sick bay, her rifle surrendered back to the armory, her hands redressed in gloves. She moved through the wounded as though nothing had changed, as though she hadn't just shifted the course of the battle. But everything had changed. Marines who had once dismissed her now looked at her with quiet respect when she passed. Sailors whispered her name. Martinez stayed close, carrying supplies, his eyes still holding that flicker of awe. Yet Sarah herself felt heavier. Every life she saved reminded her of the lives she had ended, or at least stopped. Was there a difference? She hadn't pulled the trigger into a chest. She had aimed at engines' hulls. She hadn't killed, not directly, but she had left men stranded, helpless, captured. Some might call that mercy, others would call it judgment. Her hand stitched a wound, but her mind replayed the flare exploding against the container, the sniper jerking, the Admiral spared by inches. She threaded sutures, but her memory replayed the spray of seawater as her bullet tore into the RHIB's engine. She was both healer and fighter now, and the duality tore at her. Commander Hayes appeared at her side hours later, her scrub streaked with blood, her face lined with exhaustion. She placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "You did what had to be done," she said quietly. Sarah kept her eyes on the sailor she was treating. "I broke protocol." Hayes's grip tightened. "Protocol almost killed us all. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Sarah nodded faintly, but the weight didn't lift. By nightfall, the wounded were stabilized. The captured attackers sat under guard in a secured section of the hangar bay, and the ship itself had quieted, though unease hung in the air like smoke after a fire. Sarah was summoned to the Admiral's ready room. She walked there slowly, her heart pounding with every step. Her uniform still bore faint stains of blood. Her hands smelled of antiseptic, and her mind churned with questions. When she entered, was seated at his desk, his cap set aside, his face drawn but steady. He gestured for her to sit. "Mitchell," he began, his voice calm but firm. "6 hours ago I confined you to quarters. I dismissed your warnings, and in doing so I nearly handed this ship to the enemy." Sarah sat rigid, unsure how to respond. Leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "You saw what none of us did. You acted when no one else would, and you saved not just me, but this entire command." Her throat tightened. She had imagined this moment, dreamt of vindication, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like gravity. "Sir," she said softly, "I only did what was necessary." His mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Necessary, yes, that's one word for it, but let me be clear, you proved something today. That expertise isn't always where we expect it, that sometimes the very person we dismiss is the one we need most." Sarah looked down, her hands folded in her lap. "I didn't want this. I enlisted to heal, to save lives." "And you did," said firmly. "You saved lives with sutures and with a rifle. Don't mistake one for a betrayal of the other. They are the same fight, two sides of the same coin." She swallowed, uncertain. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Mitchell, I owe you an apology. More than that, I owe you recognition. You weren't only a medic. You were exactly what this ship needed when it needed it most." Her chest ached at the words, the validation she had never expected to hear. But validation didn't erase the images replaying in her mind. She stood finally, her voice quiet but steady. "Sir, I'll return to my duties in sick bay." His eyes lingered on her, thoughtful. "Yes, but understand, Mitchell, this isn't the end of it. Today proved something about you, something we cannot ignore." Her heart beat faster. She didn't ask what he meant. She wasn't sure she wanted to know. She saluted, turned, and left, the Admiral's words echoing in her mind. Not only a medic. Never only a medic. That night Sarah stood alone on deck, the harbor lights twinkling faintly in the distance. The sea was calm again, but inside her, the storm still raged. She had crossed a line, and though the ship had survived, she wasn't sure if she had. Her father's voice whispered in memory. "Sometimes silence is the sharpest weapon. Sometimes it's the only shield you'll ever have." Sarah closed her eyes, the wind brushing her face. She wondered if he would have been proud or afraid of what she had become. And somewhere in the shadows, the realization grew. This wasn't over. Not for her, not for the Constellation. Because wars weren't just fought with guns. They were fought with recognition, with trust, with the willingness to listen to voices no one expected. And Sarah Mitchell had just proven hers. What if one miss ended everything? That thought clawed at Sarah as dawn bled across the horizon, painting the water in cold streaks of gray and silver. The harbor was quiet, deceptively calm, but the silence was tense, like the held breath before a storm breaks. The captured militants had been secured, but intelligence teams uncovered something else in the night. Not all of them had been caught. A second sniper element had slipped away in the chaos, and now, just before sunrise, reports whispered through the comms. Movement near the oil storage tanks beyond the pier. A final strike. A desperate, devastating attempt. If they ignited the tanks, the fire could spread across the harbor, consuming ships, fuel lines, everything. Sarah stood on the superstructure once more, the M110 rifle heavy in her arms. Her uniform clung to her with the stiffness of dried sweat and salt. She hadn't slept. She hadn't eaten. Her hands smelled faintly of blood and gun oil. Martinez crouched beside her again, spotting scope ready. His voice was low, steady. "They're good, professionals. Whoever's out there knows what they're doing." Sarah's jaw tightened. She didn't need him to tell her. She could feel it. The invisible chess match of snipers, each movement answered by silence. Her father's words echoed through memory. Sniping isn't about pulling a trigger, it's about patience, discipline, knowing when not to shoot. She adjusted her scope, scanning the tank farm in the distance. Shadows played tricks among the pipes and ladders. Any one of them could hide a rifle. Her chest rose and fell slowly. She couldn't afford nerves, not now. Over comms, Admiral's voice carried through the static. "Mitchell, you're our precision. That tank farm cannot go up. You understand?" Her throat tightened. He wasn't asking, he was trusting. "I understand, sir," she said, her voice low. She pressed her cheek to the stock, the world narrowing into the glass circle of the scope. Martinez whispered range data, wind calls, bearings. She listened, but more than that, she felt. The harbor breeze on her skin, the faint shimmer of heat rising even at dawn, the rhythm of her own breath. And then there, movement, a glint of glass catching first light, a scope just for a heartbeat before vanishing back into shadow. Her pulse steadied, she had them. 200 meters, Martinez breathed, bearing 185 just above the second tank. Sarah adjusted, her finger brushed the trigger. But she didn't fire. She waited. The shadow shifted again, a silhouette crawling patient, the sniper setting up, aligning on the tanks. Sarah exhaled, found the pause between heartbeats, and squeezed. The rifle cracked. Through the scope she saw the figure jerk back, rolling into the shadows. Not a kill, not clean, but enough to disrupt. Martinez cursed softly. "You hit him, but he's still moving." Sarah racked the bolt, chambering another round. The silence after the shot was worse than gunfire, heavy with expectation. She swept her scope across the tanks, searching. There another glint, another rifle, not one sniper, two. "Second shooter," Martinez hissed. Sarah swung, heart hammering. The second sniper was braced, steady, scope aimed, not at the tanks, at her. For a split second, she saw it, the lens reflecting her own face back at her. Her breath caught, her father's voice whispered, "If you see him first, you live. If he sees you first, you die." She fired. The round tore through the glass. The sniper collapsed, rifle clattering against steel. Martinez exhaled hard. Target down, one left. But Sarah didn't relax. She scanned, breath ragged, searching for the first sniper. He was wounded, not dead, and a wounded man could still fire. Minutes crawled by, every second an eternity. Sweat ran into her eyes, her muscles burned from holding so still. The world shrank into silence and shadows. Then she saw it, the faintest motion. A figure dragging himself along the catwalk, rifle still in hand, barrel angled toward the tanks. Sarah's stomach twisted. He wasn't aiming to survive. He was aiming to complete the mission, even dying. Her finger tightened, but doubt seared through her. What if she missed? What if her round struck the tank instead, igniting everything she was trying to save? Her breath hitched, her vision blurred with fear. Martinez's voice was barely a whisper. "Sarah, trust yourself." Her father's voice rose with his, memory and present fusing. "Respect the shot. Trust the silence." She exhaled, found the stillness inside, aligned crosshairs on the man's chest, and fired. The sniper jerked, the rifle slipping from his grasp. His body slid lifelessly across the catwalk, falling into the shadows below. Silence followed, no movement, no glint, no threat. Sarah lowered the rifle slowly, her body trembling, tears blurring her vision. She had done it. The tanks were safe. The harbor was safe. But the weight of what she had carried in that silence pressed down harder than any wound she had treated. Martinez touched her shoulder gently. "It's over. You stopped them." She nodded faintly, unable to speak. Over comms, voice broke through again. "All stations, threat neutralized, outstanding work." A pause, then softer, "Mitchell, well done." Sarah closed her eyes. His words didn't feel like victory. They felt like confirmation of something she wasn't sure she wanted to be. She was a medic, she was a sniper, she was both. And in the silence between shots, she had realized a truth she could never unlearn. Sometimes saving lives meant taking them first. How do you return to who you were, once you've crossed a line you swore never to touch? That question followed Sarah in the days after the harbor fight. The USS Constellation sailed once more, leaving Djibouti behind, but the echoes of the ambush lingered in every corner of the ship. Bullet scars marked the steel, fresh welds patched holes, and the med bay still smelled faintly of antiseptic and smoke. The crew carried on. That was the Navy way. Orders given, duties executed, watch after watch standing firm. But beneath the routines, something had shifted. Sailors whispered her name in the mess decks. Marines nodded with quiet respect when she passed. Even officers who once overlooked her now met her gaze. Not only a medic, not anymore. Yet Sarah herself felt heavier than ever. She walked the same corridors, performed the same duties, but she wasn't the same person. Every time her hands pressed gauze to a wound, she remembered the weight of the rifle in them. Every time she stitched flesh, she remembered crosshairs aligning on a man's chest. She saved lives and ended them, and now she had to carry both truths at once. She didn't know if she could. 2 nights later, she stood alone on the weather deck. The sea was black glass under the moon, the horizon endless. She leaned against the railing, the salt wind brushing her face, her thoughts loud in the silence. Her father's voice haunted her still. "You can't choose what the world makes of your skills, Sarah. All you can choose is why you use them." She closed her eyes, gripping the cold steel rail. Why had she done it? To save the crew, or because some hidden part of her had been waiting for this, waiting for the chance to prove she was more than the box they had put her in. The thought scared her. Footsteps approached. She turned, startled, to see Admiral stepping onto the deck. His cap was tucked under his arm, his face lined, older than she'd ever noticed before. For a moment, he looked less like the untouchable figure of command and more like a man carrying his own ghosts. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked quietly. Sarah shook her head. "Too loud in here." She tapped her temple. Joined her at the rail, staring out at the dark horizon. The silence between them stretched, heavy but not uncomfortable. Finally he spoke. "You saved my life twice, maybe 3 times. You saved this ship." Sarah's throat tightened. "I did what I had to." He nodded slowly. "Yes, you did, and that's what I've been thinking about, what it means to do what we have to." She turned, studying him. He wasn't delivering a speech. He wasn't playing the Admiral. He was just a man trying to put words to something difficult. I confined you because I thought I was protecting order, he continued. Because if every sailor followed their instincts instead of their orders, we'd fall into chaos. But in doing that, I nearly doomed us all. His jaw clenched. You were right. I was wrong. The admission stunned her, not because she hadn't earned it, but because she'd never expected to hear it from him. You trusted what you saw, said, and you acted when I didn't. That's courage, but it's also a burden, and I know it weighs on you. Sarah looked back at the horizon, her chest tight. I'm not sure what it makes me, sir. A medic doesn't shoot. A sniper doesn't patch wounds. I don't know what I am anymore. Was quiet for a long moment. Then he said softly, maybe you're both. Maybe that's what makes you dangerous to the enemy and to anyone who underestimates you. Sarah let the words sink in. They didn't comfort her, but they felt true. The Admiral turned, his voice steady again. There will be inquiries, reports. The brass will want to know how one corpsman stopped an ambush and took down trained snipers. I'll tell them the truth, that without you, we'd be burying half this crew. Her chest ached at the thought. Recognition was never what she'd wanted. What she wanted was silence, healing, normalcy, and yet she knew there was no going back. Sir, she said quietly, I didn't enlist to take lives. Met her eyes. No one sane ever does. The wind stirred between them, carrying the smell of salt and steel. You'll have to decide, he added. What you want to be, I can't order that for you. No one can. Sarah nodded faintly. It was the truth she dreaded. The choice wasn't the Navy, or her father's, or Evan's. It was hers. In the weeks that followed, the Constellation resumed her mission. Official reports called the Djibouti ambush a foiled attempt. Medals were discussed, commendations drafted, but none of that mattered to Sarah. What mattered were the sailors who walked the decks because she had acted. What mattered were the wounded who laughed again in sick bay. What mattered were the silences she carried now. The silences between gunshots, between heartbeats, between decisions that could never be undone. Some nights she dreamed of the flare exploding in red fire. Some nights she saw the glint of a sniper's scope catching her eye. But other nights she saw faces, grateful, alive, unbroken. And those were the dreams that kept her moving forward. One evening, as the sun bled into the sea, she sat alone in the med bay, writing in a notebook she rarely let anyone see. She wrote not about blood or bullets, but about choices, about silence, about dignity. Her words trembled on the page. Sometimes healing means stopping the wound before it opens. Sometimes protection means pulling a trigger before someone else can. And sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. She closed the notebook, exhaling slowly. For the first time since Djibouti, she felt steady. Not healed, not whole, but steady. She wasn't only a medic. She wasn't only a sniper. She was Sarah Mitchell, and she would carry both truths for as long as she lived.